Well, good morning, everyone, and earlier for some of you than others. My name is Michael Gutter. I'm with the University of Florida, and I'm here on behalf of the E-Extension, Financial Security for All Community of Practice. And then we're hosting a web conference today to help you learn a little bit more about tips for funeral planning. When a loved one dies, grieving family members and friends often are confronted with dozens of decisions about the funeral, all of which must be made quickly and often under a lot of emotional duress. This webinar is going to help you find answers to some of these questions. What kind of funeral should it be? What funeral provider should you use? Should you bury or cremate the body? Donate it to science? So many questions that we can have, and usually at a time when we're least prepared to be dealing with such questions. So join us today, and our featured presenter from the FTC, Carol Kando-Pineda, is counsel in the FTC's Division of Consumer and Business Education, where she builds outreach partnerships with large organizations and leads them to create and distribute free resources, print materials, websites, social media, audio, and video, something that a lot of us know well. These materials help people spot, stop, and avoid fraud, manage their money, and make wise purchases. Carol began her FTC career in 1990 as a staff attorney, bringing false advertising cases, and then became legislative counsel, serving as a liaison between the Commission and the U.S. Congress. She earned her AB from Harvard College and her JD from Suffolk University School of Law. At the end of the web conference, I'll ask you all to share your email address, and we'll be contacting you about obtaining CEU credits for those of you that are interested. But at this time, I'd like to make sure that I turn this over and give our presenter all the time that she's going to need. So Carol, the show is yours, and I'll chime in when we have some great questions.
Thank you so much, Michael. And welcome, everyone. I'm Carol Kando-Pineda, an attorney with the Federal Trade Commission in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate your turning out and giving me an hour of your time, an hour plus. I know everybody's really busy, and it's a valuable resource to have your attention. So I really appreciate it. And I hope you can come away from this webinar with some helpful tips and kind of a good overview of the things to be thinking about if you're thinking about planning a funeral, if you want to run programs for your clients about how to run funerals, if the folks in your community need some help with this, that hopefully you'll have the resources to help them out. I'll tell you a little bit more about how we create our materials. In the course of our investigations, which are generally fraud related, but sometimes we have actual rules like the funeral rule that I'm going to be telling you about, so that we have experience in different industries and with different business practices. So in the course of doing those investigations and learning about those things, we also run across kind of what the best practices are and things that consumers should avoid, and just helpful bits of information. And my shop turns those into practical tips, things that you can actually act on to protect yourself, things that you can know to help you make a wiser decision. And so we do that in a variety of ways. When we get those consumer messages, we'll either produce print materials, a lot of websites, social media content, audio, video, bookmarks, any way that we can think of to reach a particular targeted audience, depending on the issue, depending on who we're trying to reach, how wide it is, how big the issue is. Sometimes we'll use all of those things, sometimes we'll just use some of them. And so that's how we have the basis of our materials. And I'll explain to you how you can get to more of those materials later. But for now, let's start with talking a little bit about funerals in general. Let's talk a little bit about the background. So we'll talk about the kinds of funerals. We'll talk a little bit about comparison shopping, which I know sounds like a really odd thing, but you need to think of this as you would almost any other consumer transaction. And you're going to probably come out getting your needs met and being able to purchase the preferences that you want and stay within a budget and not feel like you overspent or didn't get exactly what you needed. So sometimes just thinking about this a little bit ahead of time can go a long way to helping you prepare. We'll talk a little bit about the actual planning and prepaying or planning your own funeral. And then we'll recap some of what those rights are under the funeral rule and how they relate to all that planning and where you can get more information, how to resolve complaints. So let's talk first about kind of the kinds of funerals that there are generally here. You want to think about your background and your traditions, what your preferences are. You need to factor in the budget because there are a lot of options. and there probably are more options now than there ever have been. You can sort of pick and choose a lot of different things. There are misconceptions about things that you must have that you might think are required by law that perhaps aren't. So it's good to know that. I had a little fun fact here about the cost of a funeral. In 1960, the cost of a funeral was $708. In 2009, it was $6,560. So clearly, a big purchase. It's probably one of the bigger purchases you'll make in the course of your life, behind a home and an automobile. So you want to put the same amount of thought into that purchase as you would with any other. So some of the things to think about are, is it going to be an elaborate kind of a funeral, or is it going to be simple, public or private, religious or secular? Where do you want it to be held? Will it be held in the funeral home? Will it be held in a church or another kind of a venue? Will it just be a memorial service? Will the body be present? Is there going to be a viewing if the body is present? Will the casket be open or closed? And ultimately, do you want the remains to be buried or cremated? So in terms of the kind of funerals that are being held today, that are being offered, there's the traditional, a full service funeral, a direct burial, or a direct cremation. So the full service funeral, that's what funeral providers generally refer to as the traditional funeral. It's what you may think of when you imagine a funeral, with a hearse, a ceremony either in a religious facility or the funeral home, a graveside service perhaps. There's a viewing and a visitation ahead of time. It's a formal service. You use a hearse to transport the body to the funeral site in the cemetery. There's some kind of burial at a gravesite or entombment, or cremation with the service. It's generally the most expensive kind of a funeral. So what you're paying there are the costs for the funeral home's basic service fees, and we'll get a little bit more into detail on these things. Embalming and dressing the body, rental of the funeral home for that visitation or for the service, and the use of vehicles to transport the family if they don't want to use their own. So you may have seen that at a funeral home. The hearse is followed by a line of limousines or town cars or something that the funeral home has provided for the family to ride in. And then you'll have to factor in the cost of the casket, a cemetery plot, or a crypt, if you don't have that already, and other little odds and ends that are involved. Second, you would go to a direct burial. It's a little bit simpler. The body is buried very shortly after death, usually in a very simple container. There's no viewing or visitation involved, so no embalming is necessary. And again, we'll talk about that. You may have a memorial service, but it might be held at the graveside or later, even weeks later. It usually costs less than the traditional full-service funeral. Again, here you're going to pay the funeral home's basic service fees, transportation and care of the body, the purchase of the container, whether it's a casket or some other kind of a container, and then your cemetery plot or crypt. If you decide to do a graveside service, that may be an additional cost, depending who you're working with. Then we come to direct cremation. The body is cremated shortly after death without embalming. The remains are placed in an urn or some other kind of a container. There's no viewing or visitation involved. So when it comes to the final resting place of the remains, they can be kept in your home. They can be buried in a cemetery. They can be put in a crypt or a niche in a cemetery. They can be scattered in a favorite spot of the deceased. It does cost less than a traditional full-service funeral. And here you'll pay the basic service fees for the funeral home, transportation and care of the body. A crematory fee may be included, but it depends. Sometimes some funeral homes own their own facility. You'll pay for the urn or whatever other container you use. And if you bury the ashes or entomb them, you'll pay for that cemetery plot or the crypt or whatever at the cemetery. And one thing to know that if the funeral provider offers cremations, they also have to provide an alternative container that can be used in place of a casket. So you're not bound to having to buy a casket if you want to have a cremation. And again, we'll get into your rights and some of the other things you need to know. Again, I just included this little fact here because it surprised me. In 2010, 40% of U.S. deaths involved cremation. It surprised me because if you look back to 1960, it was something like 3%. So clearly that's an alternative that has grown in popularity. And in Nevada, more than 73% of deaths involved cremation. I have no idea why that number is so much higher in Nevada than it is for the rest of the population in general in the states. But this comes from the National Funeral Directors Association, and it just jumped out at me as kind of a trend, things that are happening in different places. All right, so it sounds a little eerie to talk about shopping for a funeral provider, but comparison shopping is really your best bet to ensure that you're making a clear decision you're going to be happy with, particularly because you're in most circumstances you're going to be perhaps emotionally stressed, or at least there are a lot of details to take care of, and it can be a very stressful time for people. So if you have a little bit of leeway, it's well worth it to try to comparison shop. Certainly, if you're shopping for future purposes, you definitely want to comparison shop. So here are a couple of things that you should know while you're going through this process. Okay, so you might not be aware that in most states, you're not legally required to use a funeral home to plan and host a funeral. Now, that sounds a little odd, but it's not a requirement. So if you think that you would perhaps like to have a home funeral the way that was done 100 years ago, you can legally do that. And increasingly, there are more and more folks that would like to try that. So there is a group called the National Home Funeral Alliance. That's homefuneralalliance.org. They're educators and advocates that like to inform people about home funerals. So they can walk you through that process if that's something that's of interest to a client. They can put you in touch with providers of any services that you might need and kind of give you a checklist of things that you might need to do. You can also just go into your favorite search engine and type in home funeral, and you'll get a lot of information that way. And providers of services, not funeral homes, but they can provide you other services that you might need to do that funeral at home. Okay, so you're not required to use that funeral home, but most people do because we've got very little direct experience with the many details and legal requirements that are involved, and it may be a very emotional time, and it may not be something that a family or friends want to undertake. They would like to depend on the services of a funeral provider to help you out. So the way you find a funeral home could be because it's close to your home and you're familiar with them. Maybe they've served your family in the past, or maybe they've been recommended by somebody that you trust, and so you're willing to go give them a shot and you have some comfort there. And that's fine. Those are good criteria to use when you're selecting any kind of a business, a company to do business with. But you just want to remember that if you limit your search to just one funeral home, if you really get stuck with, we need to use this one particular funeral home, or I don't want to deal with it, this is the one we're going with, you might risk paying more than what's necessary for the funeral, or you might narrow your choices. You might be able to mix and match your choices a little bit more to your preferences or your loved one's desires. Just another plug to comparison shop a little bit. So it doesn't really have to be too hard if it's done ahead of time. And if you've thought about it a little bit. So if you go to the funeral home in person, they're required by law to give you what's called a GPL, a general price list. And that itemizes the cost of all the items and services that the home offers. Sometimes it's a little more convenient and less stressful to do this price shop aspect by telephone, and you're certainly allowed to do that. The FTC's funeral rule requires funeral directors to give you that price information on the phone. If you call and ask for it, they have to give it to you. And they may even be happy to mail the price list to you if you ask, if you've got that kind of time and you're gathering information to comparison shop. That's not required by law. They don't have to mail it to you. But if you ask, they may be willing to do it. It's kind of a goodwill business kind of a thing.
Oh, Carol?
Yes?
Oh, sorry. Quick question for you.
Sure.
As you were mentioning that they're required to give you this information, do consumers ever struggle or deal with that? I mean, do they find that they're getting the runaround when they ask for that? Has that been the experience, do you think?
Yes, it sometimes is the case, which is why there's a funeral rule in the first place. The funeral rule was enacted in 1984, and it was updated in 1994 as part of a regular rule review. And the whole reason for it was consumers were having a hard time comparing prices and buying services, and they were being forced to buy products and services that they didn't want. Things were being bundled together, like you can only get it this way. You can, being pressured to buy certain kinds of caskets, and so the law was enacted to help people be able to compare apples to apples and be able to really look at all those prices and think, they offer this kind of a casket, and this is what I want, and this is a good price, and I like the services that they offer, or I really like the memorial service that they do here a little bit better, or this is a better package deal, or you're just able to compare exactly what you want and only pay for what you want. So the FTC, every year, different parts of the FTC go to different regions of the country, and they mystery shop different funeral homes. So we'll have a team of attorneys, investigators go out and go to 10 or 12 funeral homes in a given area. And we have regional offices, so sometimes they'll go out and they'll fan out over the city, and they'll go to different neighborhoods. And then they'll just see, are they getting the price list? Are they getting the casket list? Are they getting other kinds of lists? They know what kind of questions to ask that trigger, getting the lists that you should get. And then they write up the experience. And if the funeral homes are found lacking, then they're sent a warning, and they're kind of in this, it's kind of a business education compliance program to make sure that their practices come up to speed. And if they don't bring their practices up, they can be sued. So in general, if a funeral home gets one of these warnings, if they've been mystery shopped and FTC's found them lacking, we work with them to bring that compliance up, and then we follow up to see whether they're actually doing it. That generally solves the problem. They'll generally fall in line and do what they're supposed to do and give you the information. So that's why we like to make sure that people know their rights, because sometimes it does slip through the cracks, and somebody might try to pressure you without giving you the price list.
Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. So, when you're looking at the general price list, you want to remember that some things are going to be packaged together, some things are going to be itemized out, and you want to look at the price of the single items, but you want to add everything up, right? So the price list has to include all the items that are essential for the different kinds of funerals that it offers. So it can't just say it has a package, and the package has all of these things in it. Here's what the package costs. It has to tell you what each one of those, what the embalming costs, what their fees are, what any of the other services that are involved in that package. They have to itemize it so that you can see what it costs. And then I will show you a checklist that FTC developed that you can print out and use, and you can just write in those individual prices. You can even make 2 columns and write in the prices for each place and sort of see them side by side, and then take it home and think about it, what it is that you want, how you want to pick and choose. You might not always end up going based on price, but at least you'll be informed. You'll know what you're paying for and why you might be willing to pay a little bit extra. And if you can save money, how you can do that. And so the funeral homes are allowed to offer these packages. They're fine with that. They just can't require you to buy something in a package. If you want to pick and choose those different services, you can do that. And you want to just be able to, accurately compare all those prices. That's the whole point for these lists. And one other thing that sometimes is important, to some people, your clients may find this important, maybe not, but there's been a trend over the years towards consolidation in this industry. And so sometimes what was a family-owned or locally owned independent funeral home has been bought by a national chain. and they're still operating under the business name that they've always used, perhaps, and so you wouldn't necessarily know that. If it's important to you that you want to use a locally owned business, you might want to ask, are you an independent funeral director? Are you owned by a national company? It's not that one is necessarily better than the other, but for some people that's a very important consideration. And you can't just assume it because you recognize the name and they've been in business for a long time.
Carol, another question for you,
Sure.
please. Nancy had a question. If a funeral home is a member of the Better Business Bureau, is that a good source to check before choosing a funeral home? How useful is that one?
Sure. I think it's always a good idea when you're choosing to do business with a company you're not familiar with. Go ahead and check the Better Business Bureau. That's always a good place to start to look for complaints. One thing to remember is that not everybody that's had an unsatisfactory experience is going to know or remember to complain to the Better Business Bureau. So just because there are no complaints there does not necessarily mean you're going to have a stellar experience or that there haven't been any complaints or people haven't been dissatisfied. So just take it with a grain of salt. Clearly, if you find a lot of complaints against them, that's a piece of information for you to use. Another thing that we suggest with folks is to put the name of the company, whatever it is, and it could be a funeral home, into your favorite search engine and type the word complaints. And then scroll through all the results that you get, not just the first couple of pages. Most companies have some kind of an online presence now, whether it's on a social media page or on their own website. There could be other discussion forums out there where people are talking about them and those results could show up. It just provides you some background information to flesh out whether or not you feel comfortable doing business with them. That make sense?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. All right. So let's talk a little bit, backtrack into some of those fees and the services that we were talking about. So the funeral rule allows funeral providers to charge that basic service fee. Okay, that's what it's called. This is a basic service fee. So if you're going to use a funeral home, you have to pay that. And it includes things that are common to pretty much all funerals. So that's, the planning that's involved, sitting down and counseling you and helping you purchase the things and walking through all of that. Securing any necessary permits and copies of death certificates, preparing a death notice, sheltering the remains. It's a place to store the remains while the planning is going on before the funeral actually happens. And then they coordinate the arrangements with the cemetery, the crematory, or other third parties that might need to be involved. So that basic fee doesn't include charges for optional services or other merchandise. So what's an optional service? What are those other things we're talking about? So transporting the remains. So there may be a situation where the funeral home is sheltering the remains, but you choose not to use them to transport the remains from home or hospital or wherever to the funeral home. For me personally, that's hard to kind of imagine, but there are circumstances where people they're not using the hearse from the funeral home. They may perhaps hire another vehicle or hire an ambulance or some other way to transport the remains. There's another service is embalming or other kinds of preparations. You might want to use the funeral home for the viewing or for the service itself. If you're having a graveside service, you might use the equipment that they need at the graveside and the staff to actually hold the service. Sometimes at a graveside service, it'll be tented, there'll be seats, you'll have staff on hand to help with the guests as well as staff to help actually take care of the burial. You'll need the hearse or a limousine. There's a casket, depending on what kind. There's a whole range of containers, but there'll be some kind of a container like a casket. There'll be an outer container. And if you choose cremation, you have to pay for that as well. So those are all the extra kind of optional sorts of things. And a lot of funerals they're going to be less optional than what you would think, but they're still considered optional in addition to that basic service. Another item that would be included in the fees are what's called cash advances. And this surprised me when I first read about that. I thought, what would that be? But The funeral home is generally making a lot of arrangements for you in connection with the funeral. So that could be helping arrange flowers. It could be preparing or filing the obituary notice. It could be, if you need pallbearers, providing those from their staff. If you need clergy, if you don't have clergy that you would automatically turn to, they can find somebody for you to preside at whatever ceremony that you want. Organists, soloists, depending on the whole setup. So they may pay those out of pocket. They may pay for those services, and then they'll just charge you for those services, and that'll be in your written agreement that you're buying those services and they're paying for them, and you'll just reimburse them. So the funeral rule requires that they disclose all of that to you in writing. So you have to see that on a written statement. They don't have to tell you the amount of their markup. So they're going to be charging you a little bit extra probably for providing the service of procuring all of these other things. But they don't have to tell you what that markup is. But they do have to tell you if that vendor of that service provided any refund or discount or rebate, right? They have to tell you if they got some kind of a discount. Okay, so talking a little bit more detail about some of the more critical services that are involved with a funeral. Still considered optional, but all kinds of things you can know about that to choose whether or not you want to go with them. So at the end of your planning discussions, you've sat down and you've met with the funeral home, and you've talked about whether you want a service and whether the body will be there and will it be burial or cremation. You've kind of walked through the general plan of what this funeral will look like and what you'll need for it. At the end of that discussion, they have to give you an itemized statement of the total cost of all the funeral goods that you've selected and whatever arrangements that you've chosen. If they don't know in particular, if there's still, say, you haven't quite decided on the length of time you're going to need the staff for, or if there's still some details that are up in the air, they still have to give you a written good faith estimate. They have to estimate to the best of their ability that what the amount's going to be. And they have to disclose if there are any requirements by the cemetery or the crematory that you have to buy particular services. They have to tell you those. They have to tell you that upfront in writing. I'll explain that in just a minute. So let's talk about embalming. That's a good example to talk about these requirements by cemeteries. All right, so embalming is not necessarily legally required. Okay, if the body is buried shortly after death, then there is no legal requirement for cremation. For embalming. Many funeral homes will require embalming if you're planning to have a viewing or a visitation, and they can do that. They're allowed to require that if you're having that kind of a service through them. But they can't tell you that it's required by the state unless it is. And there's some states that require it, and many more states that don't. Most states will give the funeral director that prerogative to decide whether they're going to require it for viewings or not. The states don't generally require embalming. So if you know that you'll have burial or cremation very soon after death and then perhaps a memorial service, there's no need for you to have embalming. There's no requirement for it. So you could eliminate that step, and it can save you hundreds of dollars. In addition, it makes for a more green kind of burial, and we'll talk a little bit about that. The funeral rule is intended to give you as much information as possible to make those decisions and to prevent people from pressuring you during this very vulnerable time, right? So they have to disclose in writing that embalming isn't required by law, except in those certain cases when there's going to be the visitation or when the ceremony, for whatever reason, has to happen for longer than a few days after death. They can't lie to you and tell you that the state requires embalming if your state does not require that. They can't provide embalming services without your permission and then try to charge you for it. The only way they can embalm a body without the authorization is if it's required by state law. And there may be some certain circumstances on some states where that would be allowed. But for the most part, they can't go ahead and embalm without your permission, and then they can't do that at all, and then they certainly can't charge you for it. They have to tell you in writing that you've got the right to refuse embalming, that it's a service that you don't want. You know, hopefully we can get the word out and let people know that that's what their right is. But for those who my voice doesn't reach and who don't get to our website to look at the information, the funeral director is supposed to let you know that, so that at the point of purchase you have that information. And they also have to tell you that depending on the arrangements that you've made, if embalming is a practical necessity, if you're talking, you know, a service that for whatever reason takes place a week later or later than that, embalming or refrigeration is probably going to be necessary, and they need to tell you that in writing so that you can make that choice. They can go ahead and make that happen. Let's now talk about caskets. That's another really kind of an interesting area because it's changed quite a bit over the last few years in terms of what's available and how people are buying these things. So the casket is probably the single most expensive item you're going to buy if you plan that traditional full-service funeral. Caskets are going to vary really widely in style and price, and you know, they're mostly sold for that visual appeal. There's you know, that emotion that's involved with you know, wanting to give your loved one sort of the very best that you can give them, and the casket is kind of that outward sign that sometimes people can prey on somebody who's vulnerable. They've lost a loved one, and they might be able to persuade them to buy the fanciest, most upgraded kind of casket because that's what their loved one would want. Or you want to give your mother the best, don't you? And those kinds of things. The funeral rule is intended to help give you as much information as possible so you can be prepared, so that you can certainly buy whatever is most fitting and whatever is your preference without being too swayed by somebody that's employing high-pressure sales tactics, if you run into that. So these caskets can, on average, it's going to cost, you know, a little bit more than $2,000. But if you want to go mahogany or bronze or copper, it can be as much as $10,000 for that casket. Typically, you know, they're metal, wood, fiberboard, fiberglass. They can even be plastic. But you can also buy burial containers that are cardboard or fiberboard. And if you're choosing cremation, that may be the alternative you go with. You can actually bury your loved one in a simpler container and rent a casket if you want to have a viewing. So you can mix and match the options depending on what you're most comfortable with, what the preference is, what the budgetary concerns are, and green concerns and other things like that. So the most important thing to know when you're going to buy that casket, well, first, before I tell you that, so it used to be that you only bought your casket at the funeral home, okay? You walked in when you needed it, and you went to the showroom, and they showed you the selections, and you picked one. Today, you can buy caskets in a variety of different places, okay? Sometimes there are just vendors, even big box stores like a Costco, or online places like Overstock.com. You can buy a casket from and have them shipped to the funeral home. You can save a certain amount of money that way, and you can buy very, very fancy caskets, probably a little bit cheaper, or you can buy something very, very simple. Some people like that convenience. A lot of it can be done by phone call, ordering online, and then it just goes right to the funeral home. Depending on the other things that you're looking for with your funeral, that might be a good option. Sure, go ahead.
Oh yeah, we had two really great questions here. Number one, Kathy Bowen from Penn State asked us about a list of states that do not require embalming. I found one at funerals.org, but I didn't know if there's a resource from the FTC that we should be looking for,
No,
or any other that you would trust.
In fact, when I was putting together my remarks to talk today, I did go and look that up, and I could not find a definitive list that I felt comfortable sharing with folks. What I would say is probably so many of the practical rights when it comes to funerals. There's a funeral rule, and there's all of these shopping kinds of considerations. A lot of the other rights involving a funeral are state law governed. So it would be best to tell your clients, or if you're counseling people in a given area, to go to the state website, probably the Attorney General's website, and find out what the law is, what the consumer education is there at your state AG level. I would tell people to go to naag.org. That's National Association of Attorneys General.org, naag.org. You can find a page for every Attorney General on there, and it takes you to the AG's website, and it can give you consumer telephone numbers. You might even find the laws and the consumer ed right there that you can find and do some research, and you could find out there what's allowed and what's required in your state, and then sort of take it from there. That would be, to me, that would be the most accurate way to do it. I don't know that there is necessarily a place that compiles all of that in one spot, but I'm willing to look for it and get back to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We had another question too from Gail Rose. She was just wondering, can we, for example, bury someone in our backyard? I mean, can we release the ashes outside from a cremation? Do we have to involve the funeral home at all? In other words, or can we, use our own land?
Yeah. In fact, I'm making an educated assumption here. I'm guessing that is probably governed by your state law. In general, you can release those ashes pretty much in a variety of places outside. As I mentioned, you probably would be able to bury them in your backyard if you wanted to, but I'm guessing that would be governed by the law in your state, whether or not that's allowed, or whatever the restrictions might be. The only exception to that would be, say, if you wanted to scatter ashes in a national park, federal park. There's probably specific rules about whether that's allowed, when it's allowed, and I guess I would do some research through the National Park Service to find out whether that's a possibility.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and you're right. There's a lot of sources online, but it's hard to tell if they're appropriate sources or ones that we can recommend. There's one at alsirat.com that has kind of state by state, but I wouldn't want to swear by it myself.
Yeah, and the other issue is that we run into this with other issues like identity theft. You compile the state law, the state statute, the rules, whatever it is, and you put them in one place, and then the state updates their laws. They update their website, and that list is suddenly no good. So I like to advise people to go directly to the source that's relevant for them, and start with their AG and kind of work from there.
And Barbara had a follow-up question to Gail Rose's, essentially. Is it technically legal, for example, to take ashes to a beach or a mountaintop, for example? And let's say it's technically not legal. What's the worst thing that's actually going to happen?
Well, again, I would say that's probably a function of state law. You may get a fine. I really don't know. It depends state by state. So if that's something that you were considering, I might check into it ahead of time. There may be nothing on the books that says that it's illegal, and so if you can't find anything that prohibits it, then go ahead and try it.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So let's see. Oh, so now so we talked a little bit about the caskets in general. So as far as the funeral rule is concerned, what you want to do and what's required is the funeral director has to show you a list of the caskets the company sells with descriptions and prices before they show you the casket. All right, and so that sounds kind of like an arcane little rule, but the purpose for that is, you can imagine you're upset, you're stressed, you've got a lot of details, perhaps a lot of emotion. you're walking into the funeral home, they bring you to a showroom, and if somebody is engaging in high pressure sales or really just taking advantage of your emotional state, they might be steering you towards, that $5,000 casket, and sort of preying on those emotions that you want your spouse or your dad or your loved one to have the very, very best, and that's what they would want, or that was her favorite color, or those kinds of things. And really, the purpose of the casket is to give the remains, a dignified resting place. It's not going to preserve the body forever, and they can't make that representation that it's going to do that. You can expect the funeral provider is going to start by showing you those high-end models, and once you see the higher-end model, anything else is going to look, not so good. It's just human nature. You're going to think, oh, I don't know if I really want that now. But if they give you that list ahead of time, you're going to have an idea of the range of what's available, what might suit your needs perfectly fine. You might be perfectly happy with it, and it fits your budget a little bit better. And if you don't see that on the showroom floor, you want to ask for it. They might only have the high-end, most expensive caskets on their showroom floor, or they might, which I think is probably more common, a high-end, a middle-end, and a low-end. So, most people are going to kind of gravitate towards that middle. Maybe that's not the one that you want. Maybe that doesn't serve your needs the best. So that list is going to give you the basis to make a decision based on what you want, not on what somebody's trying to force feed you. And again, if you don't see the lower priced models on the floor, ask to see them. You've got to get that list before they take you out on the floor, before you see anything. So when I was talking, I think I saw a question about caskets for sale or wholesale. If you type in, you go into your search engine and type in buy a casket, caskets for sale, that kind of a thing, you'll see a long list. I think I mentioned Costco, Walmart. You can order through them. Now, generally, what you're doing is you're calling Costco, and you're trying to make these arrangements. And then what happens is you end up calling the casket manufacturer directly and letting them know. And then you go back to Costco and complete the order with them. But it seems like it's a pretty simple process. I think with Walmart, it's probably a similar kind of a thing. With other online buyers, it'll vary, but you're doing an online order and you're buying they're serving as the middleman for that casket company. If you look at the comments on various sites, it looks like people are saving a little bit of money by buying it that way. It's certainly very, very convenient. And you can, what I think is a very big benefit is that you can comparison shop both for features and for price, kind of in the privacy of your own home. You can look at things, you can take your time. You can even have an idea of what's out there and what the prices are before you go to the funeral home, so that you have some idea of where things fall. You might even want to say, look, I can get this casket at such and such place for this amount of money, maybe negotiate a little with them on the price of the casket at the funeral home. And if you order it that way, they ship it directly to the funeral home for you. And the funeral home can't refuse to take a casket that you've bought elsewhere. Okay, that's part of the funeral rule. So they have to agree to use a casket you bought someplace else. They can't charge you a fee for using that casket from someplace else. They can't require you to be there for the delivery of the casket to make it, inconvenient if there's a lot of other things going on right at that moment. And again, I just wanted to stress that, when you're thinking about buying that casket, the purpose is to give you a dignified way to move that body before burial or cremation. It's not going to preserve the body forever. Even if it's a metal casket, sometimes they're referred to as gasketed or protective or sealer caskets. That means they've got, like a little rubber gasket that sort of gives a better seal from water or rust, but that does not mean it's going to preserve the remains any longer. all of those features just add to the cost of the casket. So the metal caskets are generally made from rolled steel, and they're of varying gauges. And the lower the gauge, the thicker the steel. So you'll see them described as 18 gauge or 20 gauge. So in this case, 18 gauge means it's a thicker steel. Wooden caskets generally aren't gasketed, and they don't have a warranty for longevity. They're going to decompose faster. They can be of different kinds of wood: mahogany, walnut, cherry, oak, or softwood like pine. Pine caskets are a less expensive option, but the funeral homes rarely display them. So if you're interested in that for whatever reason, whether it's religious or for your budget, or that's just your preference for a greener kind of a burial, you should ask to see them, because they generally will have them out. Oh, no, not finished yet. So for cremation, you can rent a casket from the funeral home for visitation and funeral, and then you don't have to buy the casket for a cremation. For the cremation, you're going to have a much simpler container. So if you're thinking that you wanted to have a visitation but you're having a cremation, they're not completely inconsistent. You can do both. You can have that visitation with the casket that you rent, and then the cremation can happen through the other container. So the funeral rule requires certain things from funeral directors that offer these direct cremations. So they have to offer you an inexpensive, unfinished wood box or some kind of alternative non-metal container for that cremation. They can't insist that you buy a casket for the cremation. It can be made of pressboard, cardboard, canvas, a lot of different materials. There are options there depending on what you want. They can't tell you that state or local law requires a casket for the cremation, because there are no laws, there are no states that do require that. Again, this is one of those things they have to disclose to you in writing when they give you your written statement that you've got a right to buy that unfinished wood box and or some kind of an alternative container, and they have to make it available to you. So a burial vault or a grave liner is a different kind of a thing. They're sometimes called burial containers. They're very common in the full-service traditional funeral. It's the vault or the liner is put inside the ground before the burial, and the casket is lowered into it at the burial. The purpose of it is to prevent the ground from caving in as the casket deteriorates over time. A liner is made of reinforced concrete, and that will satisfy any cemetery's requirements. It's not usually required by state law, but very often a cemetery will require it. You know, the funeral director can't tell you the law requires it. It's not a legal thing, but a cemetery may require it. And if you know that that cemetery requires it and that's not something that you want, maybe you can look for a different cemetery. That's a good thing to ask when you're looking at cemetery plots, to know whether that's a requirement or not. And the vault is just a little bit more substantial than the liner. The vault would be, and it would be more expensive. It's kind of concrete, and it's kind of warranted for this like protective strength. It's not going to collapse. And just a word about these preservation processes and embalming and different products. So these kinds of processes have been used, you know, for millennia, as far back as the ancient Egyptians, whether they're oils or herbs or chemicals, to try to preserve bodies of the dead. So there's no process, there's no products that have been devised that are going to preserve a body in a grave indefinitely. So the funeral rule prevents anybody from telling you that, okay? Again, it's just a way to hold the funeral businesses accountable to being truthful, that these products don't exist. They can't tell you that these products are going to do that, particularly in a vulnerable and emotional state where that might be something that is important to you at the time. And you just need to know that a lot of these products that you're buying, somebody can't tell you it's for the purpose of preserving the body indefinitely or for longer than it will. All right, so as I mentioned, FTC has got a checklist of a lot of these different services and items. And I believe it's at the end of the slides here. Let me see if we can find it. Way down the line. Yeah, here it is. I added the URL so that you can click on that and print it out. All of this information is on our Consumer Center website, which I will tell you about. But you can see there's all the different little items that you can shop for and compare prices. It'll even help you decide whether you think you want that service or not while you're doing your big picture thinking. I definitely recommend taking that. You can bring it with you to funeral homes, or you can use it while you're calling around. You can get you're going to have to get those lists in writing if you're visiting the funeral home. Look them over, transfer the information onto the sheet, and it'll help you do apples to apples. All right, so let's talk a little bit about buying the cemetery plot. We're sort of getting...
Carol, before we jump there,
sure.
Just two quick comments, questions, I should say, and I'm not sure if Wendy's the answer to Wendy's may be that it varies, but is there sort of a specific time frame people should expect? I mean, that in terms of the delivery of the casket, I mean, do people sort of have any guarantees with this process? I think number one.
I would say, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, that was just that was the first question.
Okay. I would say it depends on the vendor, right? I imagine this would be considered a time-sensitive kind of situation, and it would be different than if you were buying other kinds of products online through that vendor. And I'm assuming we're talking just about online, because if you buy it at the funeral home, you know, they're going to have their stock wherever they have it and be able to provide it whenever you need it. But in order to compete, these online vendors are going to have to be able to get that casket to you within a day or two, so that you can use it immediately. But I would think that's one of those questions that you find out before you purchase a casket from any place online, how long it's going to take to get this, and when can we expect delivery at the funeral home? So that could be critical.
Oh, absolutely. No, I appreciate that. It's good. Those thoughtful comments. Our next two questions both deal with related to pre-purchasing of services and such, and the scams that may be associated with them, which I think you're going to cover in a little bit. So if it's appropriate, we can bring those up at that time.
Yep, that sounds great. That sounds great.
Okay, thank you, Carol.
Okay. So we'll talk quickly about buying a cemetery plot. So first, you know, it's a big purchase. It's expensive, right? You're going to be very well served by advising your clients to think about this ahead of time and try to imagine. You know, it's pretty hard to see into the future. A lot of us are hesitant to necessarily buy a cemetery plot. You don't know, particularly if you're still being transferred a lot for work, or your living situation isn't quite settled, or your family is in different parts of the country. Where do you buy that cemetery plot? Is there a family plot with your name on it, but not for your spouse? You know, there are a lot of things that come into the consideration. But if you can think about it ahead of time, it's going to help, because you're going to be able to think those things through a little bit and make a better determination. Plots can be very expensive, especially in, you know, big metropolitan areas. Some cemeteries are going to require you to purchase that grave liner, which costs several $100s more. So you're going to want to ask about that. And is this required? How much is it going to be? And then there are usually charges that go along with being part of a particular cemetery. To open a grave for interment, additional charges to fill it, any perpetual care, which is, you know, taking care of any markers in the grass and the common areas. So while you're buying, you want to ask all those questions about what services are included, what extra charges are there. Some cemeteries don't necessarily provide for that perpetual care. That's an individual thing that you would have to provide on your own. Maybe they have got a separate endowment fee for maintenance and groundskeeping. You want to make sure you ask if that's going to be included and what it would be. If you're going to bury cremated remains, then you're probably going to want a crypt, and that's going to cause another opening fee. and closing fee, and then other services for the care and upkeep of a mausoleum or a crypt or a columbarium or whatever little spot that those ashes are going to go to if you choose to put them in a cemetery. So the FTC's funeral rule doesn't cover cemeteries and mausoleums unless they also sell funeral goods and funeral services. So you don't have a lot of rights under the funeral rule for the cemetery unless they're doing all those other services. But again, state law will govern what happens at that cemetery. And you might want to see what your rights are for your particular state. Another thing to consider is, as we talked about those initial considerations, you want to think about the location. Are there religious requirements, for your family that you want to ask to be sure that that particular cemetery is going to meet those requirements? You want to find out if there are any other restrictions. What kind of monuments or memorials it allows? Are you allowed to put flowers or other remembrances on the grave? Can you buy a burial vault someplace else and bring it in, or do you have to buy the burial vault that they're selling? All those things you need to consider before you actually buy that plot. All right, just a quick note about veteran cemeteries. So all veterans are entitled to a free burial in a national cemetery and a grave marker. That eligibility can extend to some civilians who provided military-related service, to some spouses and dependent children, and some public health service personnel as well. There's no charge for opening or closing the grave, for a vault or a liner, or for setting the marker in a national cemetery. The family will have to pay other expenses, usually transport to the cemetery, but that's a good thing to know if you've got a veteran in the family. And you can learn more about that at the Department of Veterans Affairs. That's va.gov. Just go to va.gov and see what you can find about burial and funerals. You can also call one of their regional offices, 1-800-827-1000, and they can give you some more information about what's available to you regionally and what the requirements are. So, of course, many states have veteran cemeteries. You're going to want to contact your particular state to find out what the eligibility is and what benefits come along with that, what costs, any of those kinds of things. And you can go to cem.va.gov, and that gives you more information about veteran cemeteries. One thing to be aware of is that you'll find some commercial cemeteries running ads for veteran specials. Sometimes they'll offer a free cemetery plot for the veteran, which sounds like it could be a good purchase. But then they might charge a really exorbitant rate for an adjoining plot for the spouse, or really high fees for opening and closing the grave. So like anything, you want to put on your consumer hat and tell people, really take a look at what you're getting here. It may be worth it. It may be a wash, or it may not be a very good deal at all. It's certainly not worth, jumping at something just for that kind of a deal if it doesn't fit your other requirements. So make sure that the deal is as special as somebody's trying to lead you to believe, and then compare the cost of the other services out there and make sure it does what you want it to do. All right, so let's talk a little bit about planning for the future, for yourself or for someone else that needs your help. So, it helps you to designate that preference ahead of time without the stress of the rush and emergency sensation when you're planning a funeral immediately after a death. It can help relieve the stress in your family if things are in place, and sometimes you can pay in advance. Some people see this as an extension of will and estate planning, which I think is a good idea, because you're probably going to want to have plans set for your estate so that you can determine who gets your property and your money after you pass away, and that it doesn't devolve to state law or to somebody else that you perhaps did not want to get your stuff. All right, so you can go directly to a funeral home and make arrangements with them, but it's all the same things that we've just talked about, but you need to think about them more concretely ahead of time. So you want to know where those remains are going to go. That's probably the first thing you want to think about. If you know automatically you want to be cremated, then you think, do I want my ashes to be buried? Do I want to split them up among my children? Do I want them, buried in the backyard? Check that state law, see if that's okay to do. If you know that that is completely out of the question and you want a full-service traditional funeral, then you need to look for a cemetery plot and find out all the restrictions on that. And it's probably a good idea to get that cemetery plot ahead of time, as we've just discussed, because there could be restrictions and things, and you may need to look around a little bit to find one that fits all of your needs. And you don't want to get taken advantage of and pay too much money and then find out there were restrictions you didn't know about because you were in a rush and you weren't able to think through it clearly. So while doing all that planning is really good in advance, you may or may not want to pay in advance. So the prices clearly can go up, so it would be nice to have that locked in and paid for. But they could also go down over time. You don't really know. That business could close, or they could change ownership, and maybe you don't necessarily want to have your money with them. It's a good idea to review that decision every couple of years and rethink it. What if your life has changed drastically, or you've moved, or your budgetary concerns are very different? You might want to make adjustments as necessary, and you want to make sure your family is aware of that. You want to put all of those preferences in writing, and you want to give copies to a trusted family member and to your attorney. It's fine to keep them in a safe deposit box, but I wouldn't make that the only copy. You want to have these instructions in a really handy place, in a drawer that everybody knows they can get into. Everybody knows that it's there, because in the heat of the moment after this kind of a situation, if you're doing planning and you want to get the planning done and it's over a weekend, it might take you a while to get into that safety deposit box. And if you can't even start your planning until you get into the safety deposit box, it's going to mess a lot of things up, and it's going to just cause a little bit more stress. So if you designate your preference in the will, that's fine, but you don't want that to be the only place where you designate it, because the will generally isn't read. Sometimes it's not found and resolved until well after the funeral. And so by default, people are just going to make whatever arrangements they can make, because they will not know that the preference is designated in the will. So here's the deal with prepaying. Again, state law governs paying in advance for funeral goods and services. So it would be really in your best interest to go check out what your state laws are and to see what protections you have, what requirements there are. The state laws are going to vary very widely. I tried to do a little bit of research on this to get a little bit more specific, and I felt like it was just getting beyond the scope of what we could talk about today. But I would definitely suggest that you go ahead and check what your state law is. The state law is there to ensure that whatever you pay in advance is going to be available to pay for that funeral when the time comes. But the protections just vary so widely that you can't depend on that unless you know that those protections are in there. Some state laws will require that the funeral home or a cemetery put a percentage of that prepayment in a state-regulated trust, or it requires them to purchase a life insurance policy with the death benefits assigned to the funeral home, and then that way it ensures the money is kind of segregated out and saved just for your purposes, and it'll be there when you need it. I know people wanted to talk a little bit more specifically about scams. I don't know that there are necessarily scams beyond, depending on who you're dealing with, the money just might not be there. It could be mismanagement. It could be fraud, but I think it's probably more likely that somebody hasn't segregated the money properly, or they've used it and the business is such that they're not able to replace it. The business closes. The money is just not there, because if the business if it went under 5 years before, the money may not be available. So, and again, I gave you the URL here, naag.org, to find your state AG's office and be able to look up the laws there. And I always like to go right to the AG's office, because I find it's right up front. They're going to be the experts in what the law is. You might even be able to find consumer education interpreting it. But you could easily also go online and look around a little bit with your state name and then laws about the different issues. I just think the AG's office is kind of the faster way to get you to the most reputable information. All right, so if you're thinking about prepaying, here are some questions to ask yourself to see whether it's suitable for your client. Okay, so what are you paying for? Are you only buying merchandise like the casket and the vault? Are you buying all those? Are you paying that basic service fee? You know, the one that we have to pay all the funeral providers. Are you paying that as well? What happens to that money if I prepay it? Does it go into a trust? Does it go into that kind of an insurance policy? Is it in some other kind of an account? Try to get the details about what that state requirement is, and then ask the particular funeral home where the money goes, how it's handled. And you want to get these answers in writing, okay? You want to be able to take it back and review it and study it and think about it without any kind of pressure. And if somebody isn't willing to give you answers in writing that make sense and to answer your questions, take your business elsewhere. So if the money's in an account, it's earning interest, what happens to that interest? Where does that go? Are you protected if the firm goes out of business? Is there a clause there that protects you somehow? If you change your mind, can you cancel the contract and get a full refund? You can change your mind for a variety of reasons, especially over time. You want to know if you're protected, if there's a little penalty that you'll pay, if you'll just be, you can cancel it and get all your money back. And you want to know if you die away from home, right? If you move to a different area, or if you're traveling and you pass away, what happens? Can that prepaid plan be transferred to whoever's handling the services for you then? Is there an added cost? How much? Just to think about, because those are some of the contingencies that are going to come up. And thinking about them ahead of time and asking those questions will help you evaluate whether prepaying is worth it. All right, so you've made all these plans, and you've got them in writing, and you've designated them, and you've locked them in the top drawer of your desk. Don't forget to tell your family or your close friends or whoever your next of kin is about the plans and where those documents are. It's not going to do anybody any good because you're not going to be around to make sure that these plans are implemented, right? So you want to make sure that they know about it. You don't want them to double pay because if they can't find the instructions, they're just going to go ahead and make whatever arrangements and pay for them. So you're not going to get the preferences that you wanted. And they're going to pay extra for something that you already paid for. And in this case, it might be worth it for you to talk to an attorney to try to make sure that you get that, as a rider or they're in your legal documents so that your wishes are carried out and everybody knows. All right, so we're going to go very, very quickly through the rights, a lot of which we've already talked about. But under the funeral rule, these are your federal rights. You only have to buy the funeral arrangements you want, okay? If you don't want a package, you don't need to buy a package. You can buy everything separately and mix and match a la carte if that's what you want. You can get price information on the phone. Use that right. It's well worth it. It's convenient, and you can get a lot of information that way and assess it in the privacy of your own home. If you decide you want to go and visit a funeral home for whatever reason to see what it's like, if you want to do business there, get that written itemized price list. They have to give you a written list. It's yours to keep. They can't show you a piece of paper and say they showed you a written list. You have to be able to take it home with you. There's also a separate written casket price list. You want to see that before you see the actual caskets. And again, that has to be in writing, something that you can take. And a price list that's written about the outer burial containers. So all those separate products in the casket line, you want to be able to get those lists. Okay. Sometimes they'll put the casket prices on the general price list, but more often than not, they've got a lot of options, so they'll be on a separate list. So make sure that you know to get both of those. All right. You have the right to use an alternative container. That's what the term of art is in the law. Instead of a casket for cremation. There's no state or local law that requires that casket, okay? Because the casket is going to be way more expensive. And frankly, it's not really necessary for the purposes, especially since you can rent a casket for the viewing or for a service. You can provide that funeral home with a casket or urn you buy someplace else. They cannot refuse to handle it. They cannot charge you a fee to do it, and they can't require that you're there to handle the delivery. You can make any funeral arrangements without embalming, okay? I think I got that point across. So you want to get that written statement of the costs after you decide what you want and before you pay, just like anything else. That's your contract. You want to get that list of all the services, and you want to understand everything that you're getting. Nothing should be a general fee without a description. You should know what it is, and you should know what it costs. And they should tell you any requirements. You should not be finding out after the fact, oh, the cemetery requires us to do that. The crematory requires us to, you should have had this kind of a container for that. If there's a requirement in the place that you're using, they need to tell you. The funeral home needs to tell you that the cemetery has that requirement, that there's a legal requirement, that there's a crematory requirement, so that you know ahead of time what you're paying for and there's no surprises. All right. I know this is kind of overkill. I just wanted to recap. Shop around in advance, get the price list, resist high pressure sales, avoid emotional overspending. You can still love your relative very, very deeply and not spend your very last dollar planning a funeral. You can make wise consumer decisions and still make a very nice service. You just want to use those consumer skills as you would for any other purchase. The buying in advance doesn't necessarily mean you have to pay for everything in advance, but if it definitely behooves you to think about things in advance and to try to do as much research ahead of time so that you have somewhat of an idea of what you or your loved one might want to guide your decision making. Really, really quickly, I just wanted to mention, here's our price list. One more thing, a couple of little tips that go along with planning a funeral, just quickly. I mentioned this before, but estate planning. If you're in the frame of mind that you're planning for your funeral and you're willing to make all these decisions, you should be thinking about where your money and property devolves to after you die. You want to think through that. You want to have a say in that, right? I know it's hard for a lot of people. I know I have a lot of family members that certainly don't want to be thinking about that. But I want to say in where my property and money goes to. I want to make sure my children are taken care of and that my money doesn't devolve to somebody else to decide where it goes. So I just a plug in there for that. You might want to think about a digital executor. That's becoming a little bit more common now. So what does that mean? That's somebody that you designate. You know how you designate the executor of a will? Well, you can designate somebody to be your digital executor and take care of your online presence after you pass away. So they would clean up your accounts, close any accounts, archive the contents if your family would like to save the contents of your Facebook page or a website that you run. They can delete files from your computer and clean all that up so your family doesn't have to worry about cleaning all of that up. You want to choose somebody that's familiar with your online life and who's savvy enough to handle the task, somebody that knows what they're doing and that can manage that for you. Certainly not required, but it's something more and more people are thinking about these days. And one of the reasons that people are thinking about it is to protect against identity theft, okay? So you don't want a lot of personal information living out there without protection, and especially if a parent, you've passed away, then a lot of that information is sort of up for grabs for identity thieves. So after the estate has been dispersed and they've paid the creditors and anything else that needs to be paid, you can start to close accounts. And you want to notify the deceased financial institutions. Otherwise, you know, your bank account, checking account, investment accounts can remain active for years and exposed. Now, of course, if there's a spouse that's using them jointly, that's a different kind of a situation. But you just want to be sure that anybody that you have accounts with knows that person has passed away. You want to let the credit reporting companies know so that your credit files can be locked down. Again, it's different if the spouse still needs that credit line. You're probably going to need to keep it open, but they may need to know that the person has passed away anyway. The funeral director probably will let Social Security Administration and IRS know for you, but you might ask about that. Maybe that's something that you would need to take on. And you want to try to limit the information in an obituary or death notice. you don't want to put too much personal information in that public notice that's going to be online and maybe in a newspaper, because identity thieves can pick and choose information from there and from online sources, and perhaps steal your loved one's identity. One last thing, you may get calls from debt collectors after someone has died. And you have rights against abusive debt collection practices. You can find out about that on FTC's website. I'll give you that information. In general, the debts of a deceased person are paid out of the estate. There are some things a family member may be on the hook for. If they co-signed a note or a loan or an obligation, you still need to pay it. Even if, say the situation where I never expected in a million years, I signed that for my nephew because, he needed that loan to go to college. Something happens to the nephew, you're on the hook because you co-signed that loan. If you live in a community property state like California, you probably have to pay those debts. If you're the deceased person's spouse, and state law requires that you pay certain kinds of debts, like mostly healthcare expenses, you'll have to pay those. And then if you're legally responsible for resolving the estate, like you're the executor, and you didn't comply with the relevant state probate laws, you might be on the hook to pay some of those debts off. All right, this we don't need to read out. This is a list of places where you can get further information. And I don't know, it's looking like we've lost the first word on a lot of these associations. So maybe I can get Michael a new slides here so that these make a little bit more sense. But there are places like AARP, Cremation Association of North America, Funeral Consumers Alliance, Funeral Ethics Organization, advocacy groups, industry groups, places where you can get more information about different kinds of burials, like the Green Burial Council, Jewish Funeral Directors Association for particular types of funerals, but a good selection of resources to get more information. If you have a complaint about a funeral, you want to try first to resolve it with the funeral director. You can go look at the Funeral Consumers Alliance. They give you some advice about resolving problems and some tips on how to do that. Some of these other organizations that were mentioned in the previous page also can give you information about mediation. So there might be some sort of an informal mediation process where you can resolve the complaint. If none of that works, you can go to your State Attorney General's office, naag.org, if you want to find out the website for your State Attorney General. Some localities actually have their own local consumer protection agency, always worth looking into. And you can always try to file a complaint with the FTC, ftc.gov/complaint. If it's a funeral rule violation, somebody at FTC can look at it and perhaps bring an investigation. It's not like we open a case and it gets a case manager and you can follow up. It just goes into a complaint system that our investigators can look at to possibly develop cases from, but it's always helpful to have. And if it's a more state-related complaint, many states are in our database, and they can pull complaints out of there and bring their own state actions based on a complaint that you file with FTC. So that's always a good option. If you want more information about funeral planning, credit and debt, earning and spending money, identity theft, fraud, all kinds of consumer issues, go to consumer.ftc.gov and search around. We've just refreshed all these materials and then updated the look to make it a little bit easier to navigate. I would suggest that you look around there. There's lots of good resources for your clients and to put on programs too, frankly. If you want to order free copies of our written materials, go to bulkorder.ftc.gov. They're free. You can order as many as you need, and you can hand them out at programs or keep them in your office to hand out to people. You can cut and paste the content from online and put it into newsletters or your social media or your website. It's all free. You don't need permission to use it. Go and have at it. And FTC also has a free monthly one-page electronic newsletter. It's called Pen Corner, and it comes out, I said that, once a month. You can get the latest of what's happened at FTC, new cases, new consumer protection developments, and then whatever new consumer education or business education we might have. Just go to ftc.gov/subscribe, and you can sign up for the newsletter. If it's not working out for you, you just go back to ftc.gov/subscribe, unclick the box, and then you're done. All right, now those are the end of my prepared remarks, but I'm happy to answer any other questions, and I can see that there's been a very active chat going on here that I haven't been paying attention to. So I guess I should
That's all right.
See if we've got some questions.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And for those of you, you know, as you're listening to the remaining discussion, please don't forget to take the webinar polls just to give us some feedback about today. Number one, I just want to, on behalf of everyone, Carol, thank you very much. I know I learned an awful lot today about this process. And I'd really like to just highlight a few comments that I think really illustrated, you know, what became a core issue, you know, was this issue about the prepayment. And I wanted to share two examples that people shared from their own personal experience to help to illustrate some of the concerns I think that you raised. Number one, Dr. O'Neill mentioned, you know, that her mom had used a prepaid funeral, and it actually made things a lot easier, mainly because, you know, there was 1,400 miles difference in terms of their residence. Dr. O'Neill lives in Rutgers, and her mom, I believe, lived in Florida area, Jupiter, Florida, but I could be wrong on that. But in general, that's something that I think obviously is one of the reasons why people look into this. But Gail Rose, a good friend of mine back from my Wisconsin days, mentioned, you know, that for her own father, they pre-purchased, he had pre-purchased cremation services. But once they needed those services, the problem was to access them. They needed to use their funeral parlor, which really wasn't near where he lived anymore.
Right.
And that was one of the things that I know ended up coming up on the Florida's lost box that I was looking at. But those were some of the things that really came up, which of course you highlighted too, is that, you know, certain things that can change. The funeral parlor is where it is. So when we're making decisions about pre-purchasing, you know, we are committing to the services and where those services will be offered. And while some funeral homes may work with others within a network, you know, that would be something someone would absolutely need to verify before making some of those purchases. So that is certainly one of the things there too. And then I think, you know, there was an interesting one that I wanted to ask you about though as well. So for example, some of the, sorry, where was it here? So there was some concern in general about the insurance-funded contracts that existed for some of these prepayments, where people are essentially funding them through an insurance policy. And there seems to be a lot of, you know, sort of a lot of concern, I think, from at least from the consumer protection in Florida about the abuse, for example, that may happen. Not so much illegal, but the caveats in terms of who gets to keep leftover money, who gets to keep interest income and such like that. And I didn't know if you had any thoughts on that particular issue. I know it's very specific.
Well, I think, you know, speaking just for me and not for the Federal Trade Commission, I think the idea of pre-planning is wonderful. Doing your research and knowing what's out there, because even if your plans change over time, you're starting from an informed position. In terms of actually paying for the services, it certainly helps a lot of people. And you also have to think how far in advance, you know, you're paying. Those considerations are going to be different for different people, right? So if you're paying 2 years in advance because, you know, maybe you know you're planning in advance for an impending death, that might be a little bit different than somebody that's thinking, I just want to plan for this. Maybe it could be next year, but tomorrow it could be 10 or 15 years down the road. I feel less comfortable having my money tied up with somebody else. I think you might want to think about starting to set aside the money, but you can control the investment. You set up some sort of an investment plan or a savings account, and that money is earmarked for that purpose. And of course, to do that, you would have to talk to, you know, an investment advisor, a financial advisor, or an insurance agent, and make sure that you were setting up the right thing. The insurance product that I was discussing was one that would be mandated by the state, so that it would be purchased and the proceeds then go to the funeral home upon your death. So the funeral home would not have control over that money until you pass away. So there wouldn't be the same issue as them having to hold that money aside if you paid them directly. And if the state requires them to put it into a separate trust, then it should be protected in a separate trust. But you want to find out the details. Again, sometimes I feel like a broken record. When we give advice to folks, you really want them just to ask as many questions as possible, get all the terms and conditions, get everything in writing, find out the costs, find out what the limitations are, so that you can take it home, sleep on it, look at it in the clear light of day, and think through whether this makes sense, and compare it to what other places are offering. Did that answer your question? I'm not sure.
Oh, I think it was right on the money, and I wanted to appreciate that notion too. One of the links that we shared from AARP actually mentions some work that the FTC had done along this issue that you were highlighting earlier in your presentation. And I was just going to say that's exactly kind of the perfect wording that they use: pre-plan but don't prepay. And so I really appreciate that thoughtfulness, because I think that that's really something people can look at. Knowing that getting the information, getting it in advance, and I think your follow-up comment too about the issue of the timing of that. I mean, if it's 6 months away, that's very different than if it's several years away, at least as far as we would know.
Exactly.
So if there's no sort of immediate concern, then the prepayment could be very premature for any number of reasons, for changes like Gail Rose's story, of course, as well. So I really appreciate that. And again, let me just make sure we only have a few minutes left. Do we have any additional questions from our audience? So as always, a lot of great resources. I know you mentioned updating the PowerPoint. Would you be okay if people wanted to email me to share a PDF version of that for them to take photos?
Certainly.
Okay. So for those of you who are interested, oh, sorry, go ahead.
People can feel free to use it in their own programs if it would be helpful. I would suggest going to consumer.ftc.gov and reading some of the articles that we have on shopping for a funeral, because it gives you a lot of that background information to fill that in.
Excellent. That's a really great resource. And so for those of you who heard that, go ahead, and if you see my email address up there, msgutter@ufl.edu, go ahead and shoot me an email and let me know that you're interested in receiving the updated PowerPoint. As soon as she has a chance to tweak those things she wanted to fix, I think, in terms of the links, we'll make sure that you get a copy of that. And thank you very much for being so generous to share that. I know a lot of our educators on the call right now are excited, thinking that they're going to have that, what I thought was a great presentation, if they're available for their use. So thank you very much for that again. For those of you who are still chiming in, again, thank you. If you have any additional questions, don't hesitate. The chat room will still be open for a minute or two. But again, I want to thank Carol for taking her time and sharing her expertise, and a really fantastic and informative web conference.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, everybody.
Thank you. Take care, Carol.
Thanks.